Welcome everyone to Tending the Witch Wound, a journey to release, restore, reclaim, and reweave our world from the inside out. Today I have the honor of talking to one of my heroes in the witchy magical world in the science community, Dean Radin. Sometimes I call him Dean Radin because he's super rad. And I discovered Dean's work probably, back when Conscious Universe came out, so 2010, 8 years ago. And I've always been tracking, what is happening in the research world around sixth sensibilities, expanded human capacities, consciousness research. I have a deep interest and love of that. And so Dean has been pivotal in my own understanding and reclamation process of coming deeper into identifying as a witch and really claiming magic as something that I can outwardly walk with pride and power. And so I guess in 2017, I saw a YouTube video. I think you were speaking at the SAND conference, which is the Science and Non-Duality Conference, and plugging his latest book, which is called Real Magic. And I just got so excited, and I decided to go to the Institute for Noetic Sciences conference in 2017 and hear him speak live and just take in all the other people who were presenting. And it was just so validating. So when I decided to put out this course, I had it in the back of my mind that I would reach out to Dean, and so I just took the leap, and he graciously agreed. So here we are. And Dean, I just want to turn it over to you. You have a long credential list, so don't be shy. Really flesh out for the students who you are and the body of work and where you come from.
Well, I'm a traditionally trained musician. That was my original career track as a violinist. Sometime in college, I decided that it was easier to make a living with my mind than my body, because being a musician means you're an athlete, essentially, and I've never been that strong. So I've got my first degree in electrical engineering because I like to make things. And I also got advice from family friends that if you wanted to start with a degree, that would probably mean you could get a job at some point. And if you could do engineering, do that. So I did it. And then I went on to get a master's in electrical engineering because I didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. And when I finished that, I wanted to get a doctorate in psychology, experimental psychology. And it seems like a giant leap from electrical engineering to psychology, but the actual connection was artificial intelligence. Because at the time, this would have been 1975, there weren't curricula that you could take to get a doctorate in artificial intelligence. And so the only options that I had at the University of Illinois was either stay in engineering and do a dissertation about the hardware associated with artificial intelligence, which was just getting off the floor, or to do the more software approach. And there was a faculty in psychology who was interested in things like cognitive simulations and use of computers in studying cognition. So I did that. So, and then I worked at Bell Labs, and I worked at Princeton, and I worked in a number of different places. So that's all that's traditional science and engineering stuff. I've worked in those domains in industry and some in academia, but my actual interest ever since I was maybe 10 or 12 years old was psychic phenomena. And people now ask, well, I've spent the majority of my career doing research on psychic phenomena as a scientist. There are only about 40 of us in the world who can do this full time, mainly because of lack of funds, not lack of interest. And people say, well, why did you want to do that? I mean, it's risky to do something where there's hardly anybody doing it. And the answer is that having read a lot of science fiction and fairy tales and mythology as a kid, I always wondered whether the stories were true, right? I mean, certainly a child understands the difference between fantasy and reality, but I always felt it was a little bit strange that the theme of special mental abilities just saturated fiction And it's actually saturated our movies and our television, and it was just everywhere all the time. So as an adult, you look back on it and say, well, some of it is wish fulfillment. Like we'd like to believe we have those powers. We like to reduce the uncertainty of life. Even then, as a child, I knew that was an explanation, and I wasn't quite sure that I accepted it, that I felt there was something else going on. At the time when I was a child, my mom was doing yoga. So we had lots of books about yoga in the house, and I was reading about Paramahansa Yogananda and other famous yogis. And there, these special powers are not presented as fiction. This is something that's simply part of what happens when you do meditation long enough. So I thought, well, that's strange. These are the same kinds of psychic and other special powers that people talk about in the West, usually as psychic or magical. And yet from the Eastern perspective, they seem to be like, what's the big deal? This is, you do this and then this happens and it's no big deal. Well, so many, many years later, when I started writing my book, Supernormal, which is about the yoga powers, the siddhis, and then later my current book, Real Magic, I realized that the reason why there's the wounding of the witch, which is the way that you're casting it, but in other terms are simply a suppression of the esoteric lore. In fact, it's called esoteric because it's suppressed, is because of a clash of worldviews. That's what it's really about. And so we've lived for a couple hundred years within a scientific worldview, which said in a single sentence, it is the assumption that everything is made out of matter and energy, including the mind. Everything about the mind is basically can be reduced to matter and energy. That's materialism. That's the worldview that we live in and have for a couple hundred years. The worldview that most people lived in for the majority of the time that we've been humans, 10,000, 100,000 years, who knows, has not been that. It's been a variety of idealism from a philosophical perspective, and it's the complete opposite of materialism. So rather than a worldview that says that everything is made out of matter and energy, including mind, it's everything is made out of mind, including matter and energy. And so it turns our worldview upside down. So after the Enlightenment in the 1600s, where it also sometimes thought of as the disenchantment of reality, this notion that of the esoteric traditions was set aside as ancient superstitions. Excuse me, time for a drink. So the Enlightenment got rid of our superstitious past. I think there's a frog in my throat now, which is appropriate when talking about magic, because you never know what's in there. Because science considered itself to be modern and sophisticated and very analytical. I mean, all about empiricism is all about analytically studying reality and not spending as much time on intuition and other ways of knowing. And from a scientific perspective, and eventually then a societal perspective, anything having to do with these ancient esoteric practices was dismissed. So now you had not only religious suppression, because the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Church, suppressed magical ideas and paganism and the Druids and witches and all that. It was suppressed not because they didn't believe it. They completely believed it, because the religious worldview essentially is an esoteric worldview. And it was suppressed by religion because it was a threat to authority. And it's really as simple as that. The whole point about the Spanish Inquisition was to stop people from threatening authority. So as you see in every authoritarian government, whether it happens to be a religious one or one of a democratic government, anything that threatens authority is attacked or suppressed. So you get a strong suppression from that side. In the modern era, we get suppression from the scientific side. And yet, because the phenomena are real, you can't suppress it completely. So it has to come out somewhere else. So where does it come out? It comes out in Harry Potter. And it comes out in every other movie that's being made and every other book. You can't suppress something which is true because people know that is true in some sense, and so they need it. Like we need certain things. Well, one of the things we need based on our own experience is a confirmation that, yeah, this is, maybe strange because we don't understand it yet, but it's certainly real. And you try to suppress it completely. A case can be made, for example, that in China, for a long time, there was a very strong, absolutely rational, secular push to get rid of anything about religion because it was seen as, among other things, threatening authority. So this was now the government pushing religion away, and it's still the case in China, except all it did is, like it goes anywhere else, it went underground. And it's not completely underground, but in China, it's more difficult to practice either religious beliefs and certainly not magic, unless it is cast in terms of what the government allows. So Qigong is a long cultural thing. Qigong is generally not thought of as magical practice, but essentially it is. It's kind of a energy, medicine, magical something or other that we don't understand. I don't think they do either. So I'm not sure where I'm going with all this, other than to say that as part of my background is like on a dual track. I know I completely understand the power and delight of science as a way of studying things. If we went all the way back to Pythagoras or Plato's time, they were just as smart as we are, if not smarter, but extremely different kinds of culture. They didn't develop the iPhone because they had not yet developed empiricism. So we have developed the iPhone. It's a real thing. We're using Zoom to do this interview. This would have been pure magic back in Plato's time, but we know how to do it now. So it's no longer magic. It's an aspect of science and technology. So we can't throw away what we know from science. It doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, we also can't throw away the magical side. So what do? Well, the solution is, and this, one of the fears, by the way, of my scientific colleagues is that if you start talking about magic, it sounds like a regression. We're regressing to ancient superstitious things and everybody's going to become gullible and believe everything. There's always some people who will fall into that trap. There's no doubt of that. But the regression idea is not correct. What I see it more is that you look at what science has been really good at as compared to religion. Religion has dogma. So the book says, this is the way things are, and this will never change. So that's comforting for some people. For scientists, that's deadly, because now it means you can't change, even based on empiricism, you can't change, which is anti-scientific. So what you do then is, and you look at the way that science has evolved over time, and what we see is that the existing theories and ways of understanding reality have expanded. We simply take what works, keep it, and now we have to expand our set of assumptions. And sometimes we have to throw assumptions away because they're not good. So in the current state, much of our scientific worldview is probably correct. A lot of it at the edges are completely unknown. There's like someplace between the complete outer limits of the known and the known, there's this sort of band where there's a lot of uncertainty. Scientists are uncomfortable with uncertainty because that's kind of where we live. That's where we're studying. A lot of people don't like uncertainty. They don't like the ambiguity of not knowing how things work. Too bad. There are a lot of things we don't know how it works. So I would expand our current scientific worldview to accommodate magic and accommodate psychic phenomena and basically all of the esoteric literature. Not the cultural overlays that you see from cultures and not superstitions, of which there are many, but the parts of it that survive, looking at it carefully and also survive pragmatically. And you do that by changing the assumptions about the way that the world works. And so the point of my book, Real Magic, was to say, first of all, is there scientific evidence that these things exist? The answer is yes. There's actually quite good evidence. Is it accepted in science? Absolutely not. It's considered crazy within science, in spite of the fact that there's actually a lot of empirical evidence. So the solution I would propose then is to return with new eyes, looking at the esoteric literature and traditions and saying, well, what can we do with those to make them compatible with science as we understand it? So I have a chapter on the science of magic, and that's basically where I flesh out the idea on how you do it without doing any violence to what we currently know, but expanding science so that suddenly magical and psychic ideas are completely acceptable. And so I mean, this is the reason why I opened the preface of the book with a bit of a science fiction sketch of hundreds of years from now, when people look back to today in wonder at how we could not grasp the idea that consciousness was as fundamental as it actually is, because that's really the basis of the esoteric lore, is that consciousness is fundamental. So once you get that idea, none of this seems spooky anymore. It doesn't mean we understand it yet, but at least it loses the spooky overlay. And one of the difficulties is that if we have to be mature enough to simultaneously hold the idea of the scientific worldview with a very large chunk of reality that we don't quite understand yet. But it allows us to do all sorts of things that would traditionally fall in the witch's pot, so to speak. So that's kind of an overview. I was kind of meandering overview, but that's what I came up with.
I love it. Permission to meander, Dean. I want you just to flow. And, you know, you already named so many things. I would love it if you could just speak a little bit to your personal process. Like, even if the students, their personal process identifying with the witch or the witch wound, like even if the students go to your Wikipedia page, you know, like they'll be like, Dean did this awesome thing, and then here's this skeptic saying it's not true. And I know that you and your colleagues even made a website, Skeptical About Skeptics, which I think is such an awesome reclamation of space and pushback. And I've heard you even talk about your response in lectures and how there'll be, you know, it lands differently, and then people will come seek you out after the fact. So just fleshing out for the students a little bit about how you've experienced as a research scientist doing kind of cutting edge taboo breaking research, this witch wounding.
Yeah, one of the many things that actually drew me to studying these phenomena was the sociological aspects of it. It's very easy to, if you take a traditional scientific or engineering curriculum, and probably even scholarly curricula, but especially you see this in science and engineering, you never, as part of your training, hear anything about these topics except in a negative way. And so it's easy to come out as a student at the end where you think all of it's complete nonsense. It's fun to watch on movies, but of course none of it is real. In fact, I just before we have this talk, I read an article in The Atlantic where somebody is bemoaning the idea that everyone's gone crazy. We're in the post-truth era, and he expands that idea into the idea of in the 60s and the 70s and the psychedelic revolution, you have Esalen, and suddenly there's an explosion of people's interest in what the author was calling New Age kinds of ideas. And New Age actually is really old age, it's esoteric ideas. And he sees this as horrendous, as people going crazy, basically, to embrace in the modern era all of these strange ideas from his perspective. Well, this is a kind of hyper-rationalism. And I'm debating as to whether or not I should send a comment into the magazine saying, well, you know, we can use the best tools of science that we have today and test whether some of the ideas that people believe are actually true or not. And when you do that, you find all sorts of surprising things, like people do have psychic experiences, and they really do exist. And the case I'm making in my book is that some aspects of traditional magical ideas are also real. They're testable and real things. I don't think that author is going to like that very much because he's conflating the notion of New Age and psychic and magic. It's kind of all wrapped into a kind of irrationalism. So This is a pretty standard opinion. You see it a lot. People go through school, they never hear about this stuff, they talk to their friends, and they all become hyper-rationalists without realizing that that is a kind of a pathological state to live in. And those people then take over Wikipedia and write a kind of a revisionist or alternative history about all kinds of things. It's not just psychic phenomena. There's a website that I recommend, which is wikipediocracy.com. And it's people who have encountered in their own discipline, many, many disciplines, history, whatever, where an article is found to be written by some anonymous who knows who on Wikipedia as the voice of authority, and it's wrong. And so you have somebody who's an expert in the topic go in and try to fix it, which is in principle what Wikipedia ought to be good at. And they can't fix it because it gets reverted back to the version that it was already at. And this is a serious problem. It's also a problem that in some cases you'll have a high school kid go in and change history dates of things because they know a test is coming up and they want to fool the other kids in the class by getting the wrong date. This is a problem. It's a problem when you have an encyclopedia that can be written by anybody without any expertise at all. Wikipedia is aware of the problem, but at least in some topics, they are not doing anything about it. And so this is a problem. We're faced with this post-truth, or I love the phrase that truth isn't truth. We're in a domain where truth isn't truth anymore, said by the president's lawyer. That's not good. That's a bad place to be in, but nevertheless, it's kind of funny at the same time. So what does it have to do with the witch's wound? Well, a lot of it is about reclaiming what we individually know to be true by our own experience. So relevant to this is a survey that we did at IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences. We did a survey where we asked people not the usual question, which is about what they believe to be so, but rather what their experience is. And so we made a list of 25 different kinds of psychic phenomena, everything from very simple gut intuition and that sort of thing, all the way up to seeing fairies and having precognitive dreams and all kinds of things. And we simply asked, well, first of all, we bought a list of people's names that would fill out an online questionnaire. There are companies who will sell these things. So we bought like 250,000 of these names. And along with the names, it gives demographic information. So you could tell what their expertise was. Are they a member of the general population? Are they scientists or engineers? And we also asked members of IONS, who we called psychic enthusiasts, because they were kind of into it. So we asked each person, put down a list of these 25 things. How many of these have you experienced? Not what you believe in, but what you've actually experienced. So the first thing we found is for the psychic enthusiasts, 99% said that they had experienced at least one of the 25 phenomena. So we weren't too surprised at that. Among the general population, 94% had experienced at least one. And among scientists and engineers, what would you guess?
I don't know, maybe just a lower percentage, perhaps.
93%. So the vast majority of scientists and engineers report having at least one form of experience that could be considered psychic. The next step was to partition the data a little bit, because a lot of people say they have gut feelings, but they wouldn't consider that to be psychic. So we stripped out of the list of 25 and only ended up with a list where things were explicitly psychic: telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, seeing fairies, all that sort of stuff. And then it dropped, the percentage dropped a little bit, but still 87% of the general population and 87% of scientists and engineers had at least one of those experiences. And on average, between 7 and 8 of these experiences. So we're talking about a very common human experience the reason why it gets a negative connotation to it is because of the suppression that we were talking about earlier. You're not supposed to talk about this stuff. If you're very lucky as a child, you're brought up in a household that doesn't try to suppress it in the children. You may have to train the children, don't talk about it in certain contexts because it'll be freaky to others, but it's okay here. In certain environments, it's okay to talk about this stuff. And they won't lose the ability because most children around age 4, plus or minus a little bit, they're wildly psychic. They just haven't learned, it hasn't been socialized out of them yet. So part of my interest has changed over the years, and I used to mainly be interested in doing experimental tests. I still do because it's kind of fun. But I'm more interested now in writing popular books and writing articles that are designed to reach anyone, including scientists, who are simply interested in what amounts to coming out of the closet. Because I'm constantly inundated with people who want to talk about this stuff, and I don't have time to talk to all of them. But about half are scientists and engineers and academics and people in the government and everyone. I mean, it happens. So people wonder what's going on. I don't know exactly what percentage of these communications are that start with the phrase, I've never told anyone this before, but, and then they tell me a whole litany of psychic experiences that they had. I would guess maybe half of the incoming messages they get. I've never told anyone this before. And so I'll write back to them, and sometimes I will chat to somebody and say, well, what about members of your family, like your spouse or parents or something? And the answer is no, they never told anybody about experiences. And these are experiences that they may have had as a child, and they're talking to me as an adult, that they've kept in their head and never told anyone. You can imagine the energy it takes, in a sense, to not simply be open about what happens to you, which is so powerful, sometimes transformative, and yet they feel they can't talk about it. So I think that's a pity. And to say nothing of, in a world that is faced with making decisions without sufficient information, which is becoming more and more the case now with climate change and so on, it is to our collective detriment that we're not taking advantage of abilities that people have that can help us navigate how to get out of this mess that we're in. So we have a resource. We have a human and a national and an international resource that we're not using very well, and we should. In fact, we in a sense, we kind of have to. Otherwise, as a species, we may not be around for very long. So that's become somewhat more interesting and more motivational for me to try to break the taboo. And I think it is possible to break the taboo. Because, I mean, if we had done this interview 10 years ago, and I would say that in 10 years, marijuana would be legal and same-sex marriage would be legal everywhere in most of the developed world, that would sound crazy. But of course, it did happen because there have been people pushing on this for decades. And it is somewhat the same kind of pushing that's been going on in matters psychic and esoteric. But the degree of suppression has probably been stronger. It's been around a lot longer. So I consider myself just part of the army of people who have been pushing at this issue for a very long time. And I think I'm glad to see that while there will be some people like the author who wrote the Atlantic piece who are horrified to see that people are interested in these alternative ideas, eventually won't be alternative. And the people who are horrified by these concepts, what we're talking about will be mainstream at that point, and it will not destroy the earth as hyper-rationalists believe. I believe it'll actually go in the other direction. It'll actually make things much better in almost every dimension you can imagine.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything that you're saying, Dean, and it makes me think of, in this course, I'm trying to set up the notion for the students that even them participating in this energetic container of this course is creating that morphic resonance or that morphic field effect, and to open up to the possibility that there will be a quickening as they allow themselves to be re-enchanted and also bring that out into the world and be seen for it. I feel like a big part of tending the witch wound is allowing ourselves to be seen again. And your book and your research, I feel like, is really you're doing that within a really, the scientific community is so laden with materialism and dogma. And I'm curious, anything else that you want to speak to around what's needed to shift the paradigm and tend these constrictive wounds around suppression?
I wish there was an easy solution to that. I don't know that there is. I mean, if you had asked somebody who was trying to promote same-sex marriage 10 years ago or 20 years ago, how do you do that? What do you need to do? It may not have, I mean, there's some of it is certainly political action. There's been politics to push on the notion of equality, and that has pushed it hard. There's still a big pushback. And people have very strong religious ideas about whether or not this should be done or not. There's constant pushback on virtually any social advancement is going to have a pushback. In this domain, it is also the case that because evangelicals hold such a strong hold on American politics anyway, and in other countries, there are very strong religious politics. Politics and religion go hand in hand. That if you happen to be in a culture where people are afraid of these things, I mean, you don't have to search very far to find fundamentalists that are basically using black magic to rail against black magic. You see it all the time. And I wonder, do they not know that they're using magical spells and it's black magic and they don't seem to care or know? Anyway, so you have, I forget the percentage, but something like 75% of the representatives in the House, in the government, are Christians, or at least they self-identify as Christian because it helps them get elected. Well, maybe they're really fundamentalists. Maybe they strongly believe their faith, but whatever it is, it means that there's a very strong pushback. I know personally that for 20 years or so, there was a government program researching the use of remote viewing for psychic espionage, and it was very effective. And it was constantly under the threat of being shut down by religious fundamentalists who hold not only positions in Congress, but positions in the military, very high ranked positions in the military. So you have a lot of people in positions of authority within the United States who really, really don't like this stuff, either because they see it as being anti-scientific or they seeing it as being demonic or heretical. And so it would be similar to making any kind of social change, but it has to address the fear issue. And the fear issue is a very difficult one to tackle, because if you talk to somebody who's kind of on the fence about this and you say, well, one of the things about telepathy is, or any kind of distant interaction with somebody else, means that your internal sense of privacy, that you have complete sovereignty over your mind and body, that's actually not true. That is really frightening to a lot of people. And in fact, probably half of the people who contact me are disturbed by their experiences because they feel that they're not in control of their body. And it is frightening. So you can see then that we have a long road to go to make people not fear that. And I think one of the traditional ideas about witches in particular, and this goes for warlocks, sorcerers of any type, is the notion that they will be able to overcome your sense of free will. That's where a lot of it comes from, or influence your health or influence your luck and all of that. It's this fear of loss of control. We probably don't have anywhere near the amount of control that we think we have anyway. But nevertheless, even the idea that somebody else can be influencing you from a distance is not something that most people want to face. So I don't really know how to overcome that fear. It's something even that we see in the laboratory every so often. We can do an experiment in the laboratory, and most of our experiments are artificial constructs, and they're not laden with emotion. They're kind of white lab coat stuff, which has the advantage of providing very high control over it, so we know what's actually happening. As a disadvantage in that it's not very much like spontaneous psychic or magical things out there in the real world, but we have a good grasp on what's going on. So we can do an experiment and we get a wildly good result, like an amazingly good result. And the usual result, the first response to that is, wow, we think now we understand something. The second response comes very quickly afterwards, and it's fear. The result is somewhere between anxiety and what door did I just open? And the reason there's fear there is because we don't actually understand very well how these things work. So I'll give an example. I once went to a spoon bending party. So the idea of a spoon bending party, of course, everybody gets some spoons or forks or whatever, and you all get into a hyper state and you start bending the metal. It's kind of fun. Well, I had heard for years of people going to these meetings, and then they come back and they very proudly showed me a spoon or something that they had bent. And I wasn't very convinced by it because most of the time it's like a fork or a spoon that's bent at the neck, and it's easy to bend that. But every so often I'd have somebody come and show me a fork where the tines are all bent like spaghetti, or the bowl has been bent in half or something. And those would be they're difficult to do by just with your fingers. So I always wanted to see that happen because they're showing me something after the fact. I don't know how it happened, but their claim was, yeah, it feels like putty, and then they just kind of mash it, and now it's different. I wanted to see that happen. So I went to a spoon bending party. I sat down in front of a woman who claimed that she was able to bend the bowl of a spoon, a soup spoon, a big soup spoon, to bend the bowl in half. And so I was sitting a couple of feet in front of her, watching very intently what she was doing, and I was holding a spoon the same way and trying to mimic what she was doing. And then the part of the party is that everyone shouts, bend, 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 really loudly to kind of get the thing started. And we did that. And I was looking at the lady and nothing was happening. But somebody said, oh, look what you did. Look what who did? Somebody did it? And he said, no, look what you, meaning me, did. I had bent it about a quarter of the way, the spoon. And so I immediately looked at my fingers to see if I had been using force. And then they said, well, bend it, keep bending it. Okay, so I bent it in half. And it very much like people had described, it felt like a piece of putty. It just moved slowly, it bent completely. And I had the presence of mind to say, well, did I do this by force? The answer is no. I mean, I squished it, but I squished it like putty. It remained cold. It was never hot. And then it sort of froze in that position, bent over. And I was pleased with myself. And it was only the next day that I actually became afraid. And I did become afraid. I tried a couple times since then to do this, but I don't do it now. And the reason is, I was going back home on the airplane and I had the bent spoon and I had the same kind of spoon because I was going to try to repeat it. And I'm sitting in the aircraft and we're flying and I'm trying to bend the spoon. And it suddenly occurs to me, I have no idea how I bent this spoon. So maybe I'm going to bend the wings of the aircraft off because I don't, like, how far out does this thing go? I don't know. So I scared myself. He said, you really don't want to be bending metal while you're flying in an airplane. This is not a good idea. I mean, so from an abstract perspective, if somebody is able to bend metal, it'd be really interesting. You know, like, how far does the effect go? Is it only the thing you're paying attention to? Or is it somebody with a spoon next to you suddenly it's going to flop over? I don't know. So it's a very interesting challenge. It's a scientific challenge to look at that. And having experienced the fear myself, which is about the fear of the unknown, I don't know how to control this thing, but also completely undeniable that I was able to do something by doing this that you cannot do with force. And it's a permanent object. I don't have to remember that I maybe did something. I have the spoon, and I look at it every so often and think, well, how How could I do that? How could anybody do that? And if you can do that, what else can you do? So I remember a little bit about the state of awareness that I was in to do that. It was a very unusual form of motivation state. And the reason that I had that state or got into it is because of a very silly reason, but nevertheless, somehow it worked. I was going to give a talk at this conference. This spoon bending party was part of a conference, like the entertainment that evening. The next day I was going to give a talk, and I was going to wear my suit. And if you're able to bend the spoon in half, the bowl, you would get a big yellow button. And the big yellow button would say the words on it, warm former. Not worm farmer, but warm former. So it just says that you're able to bend things in a warm way. And it's a big thing. And I was imagining myself up on the podium with the big yellow button. And I got into some kind of crazy state, like an obsessive state, where I absolutely had to have that button. Like it would be like the badge of honor. I'm giving a talk about psychic phenomena, and I'm wearing the button, which says I know how to do this, or at least I did it, or something like that. So I remember that's sort of in the back of my mind as this motivational thing, and I got into some kind of crazed state where bending the spoon was the most important thing that could ever happen. And then it did happen. So there is something like, I mean, when you talk about magical practice and you want to get into a Gnostic state, you usually don't think of it in terms of a hyper-aroused condition, which I was in, but it's something like that. I mean, that is used in creating a sigil and charging it and so on. That is part of the practice, and it does something. So, you know, where we can try to simulate that in laboratory experiments. It's difficult because you need to be in a real motivational state rather than a simulated one. But I think it even works when you're not in such crazy obsessional states. You can just go through the mechanics of something with some focus, and it will still work to a degree. Just not it's not going to be a gigantic thing, but it's a real thing. And actually, that's the value of ritual. That's why rituals work, because it pulls you out of the mundane, and it can essentially thrust you directly into some altered state, which is where the magic actually happens. Mm-hmm. So I don't even remember what your original question was, but
yeah, that's kind of a perfect segue, because the ritual container, you know, I want to pull back out a thread around this fear piece. You know, fear when people have those phenomena and oh crap, now I can bend reality with my mind, and what, you know, there's a level of responsibility I think that comes up with that. And to me, it also points to that part of the witch wound is this illusion of individuality and separateness that we have inherited in the West. And yeah, you know, when I've looked into more earth-based, you know, cultures, that isn't there, and there is an understanding that we all are connected, and we do have this hive mind potential, and that there is a process for learning to use those powers in a related, responsible, ethical way. And so I feel like there might be a way to help shift the paradigm as people, more and more structures are containered, more and more containers come online that teach people how to use magic, you know, and break down that illusion of separateness. I think that will help reduce some of that fear impulse that comes up.
But notice that the hive mind concept requires enormous amounts of trust in the other people. The hive mind, in terms of the way it's portrayed in stories, is always horrific. Like the invasion of the body snatchers, the Borg on Star Trek. These are really bad states to be in. So some of it, in fact, I think a lot of the reason why it has a negative connotation is because you lose individuality. You also have a lot to gain as a result by being part of the collective, but you're no longer an individual piece. Of course, realistically, we are cogs in a wheel, kind of, right? We all play a certain role that in society wouldn't exist unless we're doing certain kinds of things. We're all contributing to the whole. Micro free will not go away, even within the hive. We still have a sense of ourselves. But working for the collective is now cast in terms of the worst form of communism, for example. Like you see people talking about socialism, which I think from a political perspective is great. People hate that idea. They go crazy with the notion that we're becoming socialists. They don't even know what socialism is. I mean, the whole point about social security is socialism, right? So I think we need very clever teachers who can recast some of the reactions that people have to these kinds of notions and simply make it like a good thing. It's a fun thing and it's healthy and all the rest of it. But that takes a special kind of teacher to recast things that people were thought was not so good and say, well, actually, no, this is maybe through experience or experiential practice. You see, actually, this is great. And then go from there. So I'm not that kind of a teacher. I'm a scientist basically, and do stuff in the lab mostly as an introverted person who's watching things happen from afar. But as part of the practice of doing that for many years, I've also learned a little bit about how to do the magic itself. And so if I have a magical practice, it is a form of giving permission to people that they can be psychic. And I kind of learned this a little bit from Russell Targ, who was one of the founders of the SRI government program, and now popularly known as Stargate. So Russell's special ability is to take almost anybody and turn them into a really good remote viewer, like instantly. He can do that. And it's something like giving permission. It's giving permission plus giving something else. It's like almost a hypnotic pattern that is saying, well, that this is a completely normal and natural thing to do. A lot of people can do it. You can do it. Here's a couple of tricks to figure out how to do it. And then they do it and their mind is blown. And so something like that, if you get enough people doing these kinds of practices, as we see already with lots of people taking remote viewing training, and even more people learning about meditation and spontaneously bumping up into these kinds of phenomena because that's what happens. Maybe that will be the catalyst that takes society as a whole and takes things that were thought to be scary and basically flip it and say, oh, this is just part of what it means to be a sentient creature. And then the fear goes away.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I'm wondering if maybe for our last kind of wind down here, you can offer even some of the data that you've gathered around how these six sensibilities, we all possess them on some level and to varying degrees. And I've heard you talk about it as almost like a talent that can be developed, and maybe some experiments just to help the students give themselves permission, knowing that it's rooted in evidence.
Well, my first three books are basically a data dump on evidence. So I didn't spend as much time in real magic on that. I do have a little bit on a chapter on it. But just to give one example of a typical experience that somebody will have is that they drive to work a certain way every day, the same way. And there's an intersection where there's a traffic light. And so they're driving towards it and they have a green light. But they just don't feel very good about it for some reason. They don't even know why. They feel something bad about it. So they slow down as they go towards a green light, and other drivers don't like that. But nevertheless, you keep slowing down, and as you get closer and closer to the green light, you slow down almost to a stop. And then from a blind direction, a semi-tractor trailer blasts through their red light at 50 miles an hour. And then you suddenly realize if you didn't slow down, you would have been hit broadside and maybe killed. So I call that a presentiment effect, in that it's a pre-feeling effect. You didn't know what was going to happen, but you felt it. So we've done a number of experiments, and now there's over 40, I think, replications around the world in different labs of an experiment where we simulate what happens in the body before emotional and calm events, called the presentiment experiment. So you typically would sit down in front of a computer and you would see pictures, one after the other. You'd see a picture that's either very calm or very emotional for 5 seconds. And then you would go away. And then maybe 30 or 40 seconds later, you'd see another picture. And so that goes on until you see 30 or 40 pictures, and that's the end of the experiment. So what we're looking at is if we're doing a physiological measure like your heart rate or skin conductance, or what I've been using more recently is pupil dilation, because it's easy now to have a little thing that sits at the bottom of the screen that looks at both eyes and measures 60 times a second the size of the pupil of each eye. So there's no connection. I mean, this is nice because it's completely non-invasive. It's just cameras looking at your eyes. We're interested in whether or not your pupils dilate more just before you see an emotional picture than just before you see a calm picture. And the pupil dilation that we're looking at is while you're looking at a black screen. So it's not due to illumination levels, it's due to internal emotional levels, because when you become emotional about anything, your pupils tend to dilate, if depending on that it's not brighter, because then it will push it back. So we have a uniform black screen. We're looking at pupil dilation, and we get good results in these experiments. And as I said, there's over 40 experiments now looking at different aspects of physiology. And it shows pretty clearly that if you pay attention to your physiological condition, so some people can feel their heartbeat, others can feel things happening in their gut, literally. Some people will notice, you can even notice the degree of illumination change when your pupil dilates. You're very sensitive to that sort of thing. That is a clue. It's an unconscious clue as to what you're about to experience. So people who save their lives by not driving through the green light and avoiding an accident, they typically will feel it as there's something in their gut, like their gut is telling them it doesn't feel right. Well, the feeling is, if they want to center, where is it coming from? It's gut. For others, it's in the heart. And others, it could be somewhere else in their body. They start sweating for no reason, or they feel tingles or something like that. All of those feelings are called interoception. It's an interior perception, interoception. And you can train people for that. So there's classic tests where if you take an electrocardiogram, every time your heart beats, it's of course getting an R wave. It's a spike at each beat. Well, you ask somebody without any other measurement, press this button every time you think your heart is beating. And now you compare that against the R wave. And if you're tightly correlated, it means you're good at feeling your heartbeat. Those people do a lot better in almost any kind of psychic task that involves an extended form of intuition, let's put it that way. And the nice thing is that you can train yourself to, with biofeedback, to become very sensitive to interoception. But that's just one way where, from the experimental work, we know that you can sense between about 1 to 10 seconds in advance what is about to happen. And there's a way to train it. So there you go.
Thank you, Dean. And I want to tell the students that, Dean has so much of these types of stories in his books, and you can even just go on YouTube and there's tons of other lectures like this where he's giving lots and lots of examples of experimental design that back up this phenomena. So I just want to encourage the students to really dive down the rabbit hole with everything that you have put out into the world. As well as, your book, Real Magic, is recommended reading list for this course. So I think it's very permission giving, and it gives a good arc of the history and the taboo. And then there's lots of little juicy little studies and things like that in there as well. And Dean, as we kind of wrap up here, anything else that you want the students to know about you, anything you have coming up, how can they connect with you, support IONS, that kind of thing?
In October, I'm speaking at at IONS for a workshop on using precognition to make money. So it's part of the Applied Precognition Project. So I'm one of the speakers, and my colleague Julia Mossbridge, who's a neuroscientist, she's one of the speakers. And Marty Rosenblatt, who is the head of this project, he's been holding workshops and having training programs to use a kind of remote viewing that allows you to predict what future events are going to be. And so they've been doing things like casino tasks and stock market tasks and things like that. This is a kind of a way that appeals to the crass modern American who's puts a value on money. I mean, it's not just Americans, but everybody puts a kind of a value on money as a demonstration that you really understand what you're doing. Well, this is now using psychic ability in a particular way that it demonstrably works. I mean, it's not easy. Making money is never easy, but this is a way of showing that if you can outguess what the future is going to be, and you know how to do trading on futures markets and that sort of thing, you actually can make money. You may not become very rich at it, but it's just the joy of the idea that you can begin to make money, which is besides science, the other way of demonstrating that something is real. So I'll be talking more about the science and the history of these kinds of phenomena, and not so much on the money side, because I don't do that. But that's coming up in October. Otherwise, on my website, which is deanradin.org, you can go to the events tag, and I list there things that I've done and things that are coming up. I've been cutting back on personal appearances because I don't like to travel very much anymore, and it's so much easier to do it by Zoom or Skype that's what I prefer to do.
Great. Well, I also encourage all the students, if they can, make it to an IONS conference, because I just had so much fun. And just the energetic container, I think, of giving all of the magical people together, it just really, I felt so charged up and had a bunch of really cool synchronicities happen after I went and just was around all of you there. So.
Oh, so the next IONS conference is July, I forget the exact dates, but it's July of 2019. And it's in, where is it? It's in the Bay Area, Santa Clara. It's in Santa Clara, which is, it's like in Silicon Valley. That's where it'll be held.
Great. All right, Dean. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with the students. I'm going to give you the kind of official goodbye here, and then I'll give you a little personal goodbye after we stop the recording. So thank you so much for everything that you shared with us today.
You're welcome.